I think I can say with confidence that every person in this room knows the name of this video game, or has at the very least seen it played once before. While relatively simple in design, Pong was revolutionary for being the very first video game to receive massive mainstream success, ushering in a whole new industry of entertainment. The video game industry has undergone many changes since they first came out in 1971. Namely, the top video games we see today are significantly more violent than they've ever been before. But violent video games haven't always received the good recognition that they do today. For example, in 1976, a game entitled Death Race came out, where the sole objective was to run over virtual gremlins. Looking at this game today, it should seem absolutely absurd that such a simple game should receive such public outcry that the developer should concede to remove the game from store shelves immediately after producing it. But in 1976, when violence was unprecedented in video games, even running over a virtual stick figure was just too much violence for a video game. But video game developers didn't allow this to stop them. Once people became more and more accepting of the video games in the 1970s and 1980s, a few select developers really started to push the envelope with their violent video games in the 1990s. The 1990s showed us video games like Doom and Resident Evil, which constantly showed up in lawsuits for as people claimed that such violent video games couldn't possibly have anything but negative effects for the players. These lawsuits were ultimately unsuccessful, but proved that society was not yet ready to accept such violent video games as a normal part of their culture. A game called Mortal Kombat even found its way into the House of Representatives, where it was argued that a game where the player victoriously ripped the head and spinal cord out of the enemy player was just far too violent to do anything but harm the child who plays it. Thus, the House of Representatives came up with an entertainment software rating board to help parents assess the violence in video games and make more responsible decisions for the games their children can play. But it wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that violent video games achieved massive financial success. In 1998, the video game Grand Theft Auto was released, with the only purpose of moving around the map, killing as many people as you possibly can. Call of Duty came out shortly after in 2003, and these are just two of the absolutely many video games that are coming out making tons of money, although being extremely violent. Fortune found that the top 4 grossing games of this year alone all received M ratings for their violent content. Violent video games are no longer being taken off store shelves, but are rather becoming more successful than their non-violent counterparts. Many legislators have tried to remove violent video games or restrict their access to minors, but have been relatively unsuccessful, as it was found in order to restrict violent video games to minors, there must be a definite relationship between the violent video games and horrendous violent acts. So what exactly are the effects of violent video games on minors? A lot of research has been done, and generally it's been found that children who play violent video games become more aggressive, less social, and generally tend to have more mental health issues later in life than the children who had not played violent video games. However, this does not prove that this child could turn into this one. Unless we can prove that violent video games can turn normal children into serial killers like we see in the Columbine and Sandy Hook shootings, violent video games are here to stay. And they're very predominant indeed. The Massachusetts General Hospital conducted a study where it was found that 10 to 12-year-olds, 2 out of 3 boys and over 1 out of 4 girls reported playing violent video games frequently within the past 6 months. This shows that violent video games are no longer being restricted from children at all, but rather are becoming quite common in their everyday lives. Even if violent video games don't necessarily make us more violent, they certainly mark a shift in our perception of virtual violence. What would have once been unheard of as a video game is now making more money than games who are less violent. It is now no longer unheard of for a child to spend his day shooting people on a virtual television, and it is no problem at all for a 12-year-old to pick up the latest Call of Duty game at GameStop. By accepting violence as a part of everyday video games, we've gone from a culture that tries to limit violence as much as possible to one that accepts violence as the norm, and where violent video games can dominate a child's everyday life.